Hello everyone, a real quick video from me today, looking especially at how we can improve our revision of the time and place poetry, which is part of the Edexcel English Literature GCSE exams. Okay, so we'll be having a look at how do we approach revising 15 poems that we've seen before, how do we make that manageable in our own time, and how do we approach the examination as well. So, hopefully this list here, which is supplied by Edexcel, will be familiar with you. You probably have studied these poems in some way or form in year 10 because that's what's commonly done across the schools in the UK, and you have a little bit of knowledge about some of them. Now I'm just going to ask you to pause it here quickly and feel free to have a bit of a look over that list, make sure you kind of jog your memory of those poems before we start looking at the exam and how we can make revision a bit more easy when it comes to this part of the course. So, the exam itself. Now, this is what it will look like on the big day. As you can see here, we have got a poem in front of us, and you will be given a clean copy of one of those 15 poems that you've just seen on the previous slide. And what you will need to do is you will need to discuss how one thing is presented in the poem. Okay, so for example, if you look at the bottom right of the screen, you'll see that it says compare how the natural environment is presented. And you'll need to compare this to one poem of your choice that you will not be given. So you'll need to obviously have that memorized to some extent, have at least some knowledge in the back of your mind on that day to make sure that you can make some comparisons. As well as this, you are expected to make some mention of the context. I would recommend maybe one or two things for each of the poems, mentioning how they come to be written, sort of influences of the writer. And obviously, I'll have other videos that will help you with this as part of the poetry playlist on Edexcel Time and Place. So, here's how I would approach this. Now, if you asked me to revise 15 poems, I would find it incredibly difficult to make sure I knew those 15 poems like the back of my hand. Even now, I'm someone who's obviously an English graduate. I've been teaching for a number of years. So for someone who's of your age, sort of 15, 16, it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. So here's what I would suggest you do first of all. Now, what I would suggest you do is you make something called a tier list. And what this tier list does is it basically prioritizes the poems in your mind for you before you start revising. So what I'd ask you to do now, and I would suggest you do this as part of your revision, is make 4 subtitles and leave 5 lines between each on a sort of lined piece of paper, and label those God, very strong, strong, and situational, and I'll explain what you need to put in those. And you need to then rank the poems based on how memorable they are, how much you like them, because we tend to analyse things better if we like them or if we find them interesting, and how easy you think they are to compare to other poems in the collection of 15. So what your line paper should look like is something a bit like this. Now, as you can see here, I've put down, as part of this, what each part of the tier list should include. So God tier poems would be poems that I would suggest linked to many themes, can be compared to many poems, that are very memorable in your mind as well. Okay, very strong are still pretty good, alright, still very good in many ways, linked to a decent amount of themes and can be compared to a decent amount of poems. Strong is where things start to become, not quite as easy, all right, to manage. Poems that you think, yeah, they're okay, but you'd try and steer clear of when it comes to comparing it to the poem that you get given. And situational are poems that essentially you'd only do in very, very rare situations, okay, where there's only a few memorable quotes that you can think of. There's not many things you can link it to regards themes that come up or can be compared to many other poems, okay? Now, I'm not telling you not to revise certain poems, okay? That's not what this is about. But what I'm saying is that if you've got poems in the situational tier, then you would lightly revise those poems instead prioritising revision of poems that you do love. Okay. With regard to my students, I tend to say to them, make sure that you revise 3 or 4 varied different poems really, really well, and make sure then you revise the others quite lightly, because that way, if your poem doesn't come up, the one that you like the most, or one of the ones you like the most, you can then hopefully compare it to the poem that they do give you in the examination. So, again, you'll see the pause button now. My advice here is to pause this, have a little bit of a go, write in the 15 poems based on your rankings, where you think they would go, which poems are God tier, which are perhaps situational and ones that you'd avoid with regards to this. Now, I know what you're probably thinking is that you want to see my answer to this. Now, I do need to say these are my answers. This is my suggestions. You can completely disagree with me if you feel so, okay? And that's absolutely fine, okay? Because we all approach literature differently. We all have different opinions of it. But here's where I've put the poems. So in God tier, I've got London, Nothing's Changed, and Adlestrop, okay? They're slightly varied poems as well, which is good, because I don't want to have 3 London poems in my God tier, or 3 poems about the city in God tier, because then I'm kind of restricting myself when it comes to my revision. But I've got there some short poems, some poems with nice, easy, memorable quotations, with some nice, easy context as well, especially when I think of Nothing's Changed in District 6. In my very strong tier, these are poems that I do think are pretty strong, I think are useful to look at. I've got Composed Upon Westminster Bridge, again quite a nice short 14-line poem, Home Thoughts from Abroad, and Hurricane Hits England. Coming further down, I've got Absence, Presents from My Aunt in Pakistan, Stewart Island in Romney Marsh, and Where the Picnic Was. Those are poems that don't really stick in my mind as much, and therefore I would perhaps not be looking at making sure I memorise quotations from those or memorise the context from those quite as much as, say, my Gods here. And then my situational, these are poems that I simply just don't feel that much of a connection to, including First Flight, To Autumn, Postcard from a Travel Snob, and I Started Early, Took My Dog. Now that is my list. Now what I'm saying is that you should be prioritising trying to memorise your sort of God tier poems and making sure you know those well enough so that you can compare them off the top of your head. Whereas those situational tier poems, those are the ones I'd be really worried if they were to come up in the exam in front of me. So I'd probably give them a decent revision time as well. The ones in the middle, all right, I would probably be lightly revising. All right, they can become slightly more backups for the poems that I would try and memorise, or poems that I would not be too displeased if they were to come up in front of me as my named poem. Okay, so hopefully you've got a slightly different list to me. We shouldn't have always the same, okay, and that you've got a nice varied bunch within each of the rankings as well. Okay, so that's my suggestion for that. So my revision would be pretty heavy on God tier, pretty heavy on situational tier, and quite light in the middle. Now, as always, we finish this lit lesson with a GCS meme, and as you can see here, we've got Madagascar meme for you that helps to kind of like summarise my message when it comes to revising the time and place poems. So give that a go. Let me know how you get on with regards to that, and give me some suggestions for anything else you'd like to see with regards to these videos, whether it be content, templates you want to use, anything else. Don't forget as well to like and subscribe for more of these videos. I'll be constantly updating them, and give our Instagram a follow as well. Thank you.